G'day everyone, it is BS Radar time, hashtag BS Radar. I've got Justin Welsh, so happy to have you on with me today. G'day Justin, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Now, for those that haven't tuned in before, BS Radar is where I interview founders and leaders and I find out their one hot tip to sniff out the BS in a job interview from a candidate. Now Justin, you've founded businesses, you've advised businesses, you've been doing this for a long time. Love to hear your tips. What have you got for us today? Go.
Yeah, I think that in most interviews, people are really good about talking about their strengths, what they're really good at, what they've accomplished in their career. And I think that people are pretty good at taking a strength and turning it into a weakness for the inevitable, what are your weakness sort of questions that come through there. So I try and use two very distinct questions to really suss out a candidate's weakness and then peel back the onion a little bit to understand why that's a weakness. So I'll kind of give you an example. The very first question when I'm diving into weaknesses, I say, what would your current boss today say is your biggest weakness? And oftentimes people will say like, oh, I'm impatient, controlling my emotions, something like that. That's where most people stop. They think they've sussed out the weakness. They think they understand where someone struggles in their job. But I think the sort of, complementary question to that is, can you give me an example of a scenario in your current job in why your boss would describe that as a weakness? So for instance, I had a young man I was interviewing the other day and he said, controlling my emotions is I think something my boss would say is a weakness. And I just said, can you give me an example of why your boss might say something like that? And now you have to provide an example of you being weak. And that's actually really challenging for people. So he said, well, I used stern language. I lost my cool. I blew up at my boss. Those are all things you're going to want to know because when you're hiring for an early stage startup or a startup that's growing, you got to suss out those red flags. So once you've asked for the example, then I turn it around. They think they're out of the weeds from a weakness question. And I say, every great salesperson that I know is also very self-aware. So I appreciate that that's what your boss would say is your biggest weakness, but you know yourself. What do you think your biggest weakness is? Now you're in round two, right? And so they say like, oh, interesting. My biggest weakness is, I have a lot of self-doubt, right? Oh, okay. Well, can you give me an example of why you chose that as your specific weakness? Now you're in round two of examples. And so what I'm really doing is sussing out red flags. And as I mentioned before, like when I'm interviewing for early stage startup candidates, the worst thing that I can get is a red flag candidate, someone who's a toxic employee, who is toxic to the culture. And so my biggest tip is to try and suss out the weakness and then really understand the examples of why they use that as their weakness. To me, that helps.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really good too because you're kind of disarming them along the way. Like I reckon the first time you ask, what does your boss think your weakness is? And they go, and they put their hand up and they've got it there ready to go. And they think, oh, cool, I'm out of the woods. But then you dig a bit deeper. Oh, God, okay, I better be vulnerable. And they probably think, okay, I'm feeling good. I think by the second time you've dug in and you're getting them to be vulnerable again, I reckon that's when you're probably going to see more of the real them, more of the raw them. It's kind of easy to have those shallow answers ready to go, but it's when people start digging deeper, especially in that scenario. I think you probably get some really good intel at that point.
Yeah, examples make things real, right? And so a lot of interview is all about surface level. And surface level doesn't matter. Anyone can be a great interviewer, but not anyone can be a great employee. So when you go a layer or level deeper, you're truly sussing out that weakness. And I think that's really critical.
Yeah, unreal. Thanks so much, Justin. Really appreciate your time. For anyone who's watching this and you're not following Justin already, you should jump on. He does great content. He's amazing on LinkedIn. So much good wisdom and knowledge to share. Justin, thanks for being on the BS Radar.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Cheers.